What happens when a company riding a wave of global racing success suddenly bets big on an engine that can't survive its own potential? Ford's 1968 Tunnelport 302 sits right in that crossroads, a power plant built with wild ambition and even wilder consequences. It arrived at a time when the Blue Oval was crushing Le Mans, dominating rally stages, and fighting tooth and nail in Trans Am. Yet this one engine managed to expose cracks inside a performance empire that looked unstoppable from the outside. And that turning point pushed Ford toward one of the fiercest chapters of its muscle era story. Now let's get into how it all began. Ford entered the 1968 Trans Am season with high hopes for the radical 302 Tunnelport, an engine built on brute airflow theory rather than real-world road racing needs. Inspired by the 427 Tunnelport NASCAR head, Ford engineers created enormous, round intake ports that routed push rods through tubes inside the port in a dramatic, clever, and ultimately disastrous way. The peak power arrived at over 8,000 RPM, which was well above the usable band for road race conditions, where torque exiting corners mattered just as much as sheer horsepower. Drivers like Parnelli Jones and George Follmer pushed the Tunnelports mercilessly, often scattering parts across American racetracks as the engine struggled to survive long stints at high RPM. The architecture was strong, with its thick main webs, 4-bolt caps, and GT40-influenced rigidity. But the fundamental flaw remained, as the engine simply could not race the way Trans Am required. By mid-season, Ford was desperate. Word from the tracks made it back to Dearborn, and veteran engineer Bill Barr was sent to investigate. Barr understood immediately that the problem wasn't effort or intent, it was physics. To compete with Chevrolet's 7,500 RPM Z28 small block, Ford needed broad, stable, high RPM airflow, not a single razor-thin peak. Barr wandered into Ford's advanced engines department and saw promise in an unrelated program, the upcoming 351 Cleveland. The engine itself wasn't ideal because of its heavy weight, with oiling flaws, but its cylinder heads were extraordinary. Polyangle valves, generous port area, and wedge combustion chambers gave it stunning high RPM potential. Barr measured, compared, and realized that the Cleveland bore spacing and bolt patterns matched the 28930-2351W block family. If he could adapt Cleveland heads to a light 302 bottom end while retaining a wet Windsor-style intake, Ford would have the best of both worlds: the mass, durability, and responsiveness of a small block with the airflow of a racing head. That insight, which might look simple in concept, was profound in impact. And that's why it became the foundation of the Boss 302 program, the engine that would finally allow Ford to take the fight back to Chevrolet. Before we continue, if you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss more untold stories to come from automotive history. Now let's dive into the next chapter and see how the stakes kept rising. Once the Tunnelport 302 showed it could rev but not survive, Ford needed a new direction with real racing value. That turning point arrived when Bill Barr studied the 351 Cleveland's developing cylinder head. The Cleveland wasn't even intended for Trans Am. It was a future production engine, but it had its own issues. Yet its heads were a different story. They carried valves, ports, and chambers that breathed far better than anything in Ford's existing small block lineup. Chevrolet's Z28 thrived in the 7,000 to 7,500 RPM band, and Ford needed something that could live there without tearing itself apart. The Cleveland head finally offered that path. What made the discovery even more surprising was the dimensional compatibility. The 351C shared bore spacing and head bolt locations with the Windsor family. That meant the Cleveland heads could be mounted to a 289-302-351W block without exotic machining or a redesign of the entire engine. Ford only needed a custom wet intake manifold because the Cleveland usually used a dry intake with coolant flowing through the block instead of the manifold. That was a solvable problem. The airflow issue was not, and the Cleveland head solved it overnight. This combination gave the developing Boss 302 a rare advantage: higher RPM capability without sacrificing the durability of the Windsor bottom end. The 302 block could be strengthened, the heads could breathe, and the engine could make competitive power within Trans Am's usable RPM band. Ford now had a technical blueprint that didn't merely fix the Tunnelport's weaknesses, it buried them. The solution was not about building the wildest idea in the room, it was about building the right one, and the Cleveland-headed 302 was exactly that turning point. The move toward the Boss program forced Ford to rethink the 302 block from the ground up. The Tunnelport's failures made one thing glaringly clear: high RPM without durability was a dead end. Ford engineers responded by giving the new block heavier main webs and thicker cylinder walls so it could handle relentless high RPM punishment. Even the crankcase got attention. The upgraded structure resisted twisting forces that had chewed up the Tunnelport during long stints. This stronger base wasn't about showing off engineering muscle. It was about building something that could stay together when drivers like Parnelli Jones and George Falmer pushed past the limits of normal small blocks. Another detail that made a real difference was the switch to a forged crankshaft with big 3-inch mains. Some racers worried that the larger mains would add friction and heat, but Ford's new block supported the crank so well that bearing stability outweighed the concern. At sustained 7,500 RPM, stability won races. The rods were forged, the pistons were rugged, and the whole rotating assembly was designed to stay alive through an entire Trans Am event, instead of just a qualifying session. Oil control had been another weak point of the Tunnelport era, so Ford revised the oiling system to improve flow to critical areas. The updated galleries kept bearings alive under G-loads that routinely uncovered oil in less prepared engines. With the Cleveland heads capable of serious airflow, this reinforced short block finally had a chance to turn that air into usable, repeatable power. Chevrolet's Z28 had built its reputation on durability as much as horsepower. Ford now had an answer. The strengthened 302 block became the backbone of an engine that could stop playing catch-up and start fighting for championships. Once Ford committed to Cleveland heads on a Windsor-style block, the next challenge was getting the engine to breathe in a way that worked for Trans Am. The Tunnelport had massive airflow numbers on paper, but its oversized round ports and pushrod tubes disrupted velocity. Air moved fast only at extreme RPM, and the engine bogged when drivers rolled back into the throttle mid-corner. Ford needed the opposite: strong velocity, clean mixture motion, and exhaust flow that pulled hard through the usable race band. The custom wet intake manifold became a quiet hero in the Boss program. Designed specifically to mate the Cleveland heads to the Windsor block, it shaped airflow with far more intention than the Tunnelport design. Port entries were taller and narrower, guiding charge flow with speed instead of volume, and this improved throttle response that helped the engine stay lively between shifts instead of falling flat the moment RPM dropped below its peak. On the exhaust side, the switch from the Tunnelport's round exit shape to the Cleveland's more conventional layout simplified everything. Racers could run headers that actually matched the head's natural flow path. The scavenging effect improved noticeably, pulling exhaust gases out cleanly and making room for the next intake charge. This is where the Boss began to beat the Tunnelport, not just in durability, but in usable performance across an entire lap. Carburation also benefited. With more predictable port behavior, the fuel mixture stayed consistent under load, something the Tunnelport struggled with when airflow tumbled at mid-range. Racers finally had an engine that didn't require constant throttle babysitting. These changes may not have been flashy, but they mattered where races were won. The new 302 breathed with purpose, and every lap felt sharper, cleaner, and more stable than anything Ford had fielded the season before. With a competitive engine finally in hand, Ford faced the next hurdle: SCCA homologation. To run the new power plant in Trans Am, Ford had to build a street-going version, one that looked the part, idled without drama, and could be sold nationwide. The Tunnelport never reached this stage. It was too fragile, too narrowly focused, and too expensive to civilize for mass production. But the Boss 302 was different. It had the bones of a race engine, yet behaved well enough for dealership delivery, provided the engineering team could translate track prowess into street durability. Production kicked off in April 1969, making the Boss 302 a mid-year Mustang designed not just to sell cars, but to send a message. Ford wasn't retreating from factory-backed racing. The car's debut swaggered with unique visual cues like functional scoops, competition-inspired striping, and signature "Power by Ford" stamped steel valve covers carried over from late 1968. Beneath that sheet metal was the new hybrid Cleveland/Windsor power plant, tuned for reliability without neutering its race-bred personality. The homologation process forced clever engineering compromises. Cooling passages were integrated into the Cleveland-based head castings, so they could work with the 289-302-351W style wet intake. The race-ready valve train was softened, but not declawed. Even with a mandated electronic rev limiter, the Street Boss still spun to 6,950 RPM, livelier than anything Ford had ever sold off the showroom floor. Ford's strategy worked. The car landed with the force of a thrown gauntlet, rallying the brand's racing identity at a time when increasing insurance rates and looming emissions rules were already threatening muscle cars' survival. For customers, the Boss 302 wasn't just another performance trim, it was the closest a buyer could get to owning a Trans Am contender. The Tunnelport had failed to become Ford's street-legal hero. The Boss 302 succeeded by being everything the Tunnelport couldn't. Ford's 1968 Tunnelport 302 arrived with huge expectations and an even bigger appetite for mechanical punishment. On paper, its engineering looked inspired. Large round intake ports fed by straight runners, push rods isolated in slender tubes, and breathing potential that mimicked big league racing engines. In practice, it became a brilliant but hopelessly fragile experiment, an engine that could howl at extraordinary RPM, but rarely stayed intact long enough to exploit its theoretical advantage. Teams discovered immediately that the Tunnelport produced power only when spun to extremes. Its torque curve was thin, its drivability narrow, and its usable window almost comically small for road course racing. Where rivals like Chevrolet's Z28 delivered flexible mid-range strength, the Ford demanded violent revs just to remain competitive. That mismatch created endless drama, burned pistons, valve train distress, and catastrophic failures with debris scattered across more than one circuit. Mechanics joke that if the Tunnelport finished a race, it deserved its own victory lap. Adding to the intrigue was Ford's quiet navigation of homologation requirements. A street version was drawn up and internally discussed, yet no production cars ever emerged. The SCCA paperwork of 1968 remains murky, leaving historians to guess how the project squeezed through the rulebook. This ambiguity has given the Tunnelport an almost mythical aura, an engine that officially existed, unofficially competed, and practically self-destructed. Because most engines perished in combat, surviving parts are rare. The distinctive Tunnelport intake is nearly unobtainable, and original heads rarely surface. Ironically, the rugged Windsor block underneath often survived the carnage and later helped form the basis of what became the Boss 302. In the end, the Tunnelport wasn't fully a success, but it was sure a catalyst, and its shortcomings forced Ford to rethink everything, clearing the path for the far superior Boss-era engineering that followed. The 1969 Trans Am season hit like a hammer, and the Tunnelport legacy still echoed through every garage stall. By then, Ford had shifted fully to the Boss 302 program, but the brutality of the previous year shaped every strategic move. Bud Moore Engineering carried Ford's banner, while across the paddock, Roger Penske's Camaro Z28s formed a blue and yellow wall that seemed impossible to crack. Mark Donohue dominated with a clinical efficiency that made his rivals look underprepared. Wins at Briar, Mont Tremblant, Watkins Glen, Laguna Seca, Sears Point in Riverside painted the standings with Chevrolet's fingerprints. Moore's Mustang showed flashes of brilliance. Parnelli Jones muscled his way to victories at Michigan and Donnybrook, and George Falmer added a triumphant run at Bridgehampton. Sam Posey, driving for Carroll Shelby's outfit, scored at Lime Rock. Ford had talent, grit, and raw performance, but the Camaro's consistency was brutal. Every mechanical weakness, every setup gamble, every strategic hesitation was punished. Ford's earlier Tunnelport misadventures served as a reminder of what happened when big potential wasn't backed by durability or clarity of direction. For 1969, the Boss 302 power plant was far more refined, but Ford still faced an enemy operating at peak precision. Penske's team ran like a military unit, squeezing more out of the Z28 package than anyone thought possible. That season set the tone for what followed. Chevrolet seized the championship again, forcing Ford to double down, reorganize, and prepare for a final all-out assault in 1970. The pressure from Penske, the memory of the Tunnelport's failures, and the hunger to reclaim the crown created a perfect storm inside Ford's performance divisions. The fire was lit, and the next season would prove whether the Blue Oval had learned from its turbulence or was destined to repeat it. By the dawn of the 1970s, the momentum behind Ford's racing juggernaut was crumbling. The Tunnelport saga, the Boss Wars, and the non-stop Trans Am grind had pushed the company's performance culture to its peak, but the crash was already forming behind the scenes. When the 1970 models rolled out, a shockwave hit the corporate ladder. Simon Bunky Knudsen was fired in September, barely a year after championing Ford's most ambitious performance projects. 2 weeks later, Larry Shinoda, the designer who gave the Boss lineup its visual punch, was also dismissed. With those departures, the programs lost their loudest advocates, and the atmosphere shifted overnight. At the same time, the rule books that once encouraged innovation tightened. The SCCA raised the Trans Am homologation threshold to a staggering 7,000 units, forcing Ford to spread Boss 302 production across both Dearborn and Metuchen just to stay eligible. NASCAR's technical boundaries shifted as well, reshaping the future of engines like the 429 shotgun. Rising insurance rates for powerful cars, early emissions regulations, and the looming oil and geopolitical instability that would soon buckle the industry. Car craft, Ford's secret weapon for everything exotic, lasted only slightly longer. The Brighton plant that built the Boss 429 shut down in 1969, and by November 1970, the entire operation folded. Carroll Shelby had already stepped away after 1969, signaling that the performance era was losing its oxygen. As the curtain fell, the fierce experimentation that once defined Ford's racing division evaporated. The Tunnelport 302 and its Boss successors became relics of a window in time when Detroit still chased glory without hesitation. Within a year, that world was gone, replaced by caution, regulation, and the early rumblings of the fuel-conscious 1970s. The 1968 Tunnelport 302 may have stumbled in its own moment, but the echoes it left behind reshaped Ford's entire approach to performance. What looked like a technical misfire became a turning point that engineers and racers kept referencing long after the engine disappeared from competition. The Tunnelport's oversized ports, straight-shot airflow, and exotic architecture proved that raw airflow alone couldn't win a championship. It showed that race engines needed balance, durability, and flexibility, not just peak horsepower figures written on a dyno sheet. Inside Ford, the lessons hit hard. The Tunnelport forced teams to rethink cylinder head design, valve train stability, and block strength in a way no successful engine ever would have demanded. Its flaws sparked breakthroughs that fed directly into the Boss 302's development. The canted valve Cleveland-style heads, the reinforced Windsor block, the improved oiling systems, and the sharper understanding of what a Trans Am motor actually needed all came from wrestling with the Tunnelport's contradictions. Ford didn't bury the project, it mined it. Racers remembered it too. They spoke about its unbelievable top-end pull, its thrill when everything worked, and the heartbreak when it didn't. That paradox gave the Tunnelport an aura that engines like the Z28's small block simply never carried. It became the what-if motor of the late 60s, a symbol of the era's fearless experimentation. Today, the Tunnelport's rarity turns surviving pieces into prized artifacts. Collectors hunt for the iconic heads. Restorers whisper about the few blocks that lived through competition. It remains the kind of engine whose failures taught more than most victories ever could. In the grand story of Ford's performance, the Tunnelport isn't the hero. It's the misfit genius that forced everyone around it to evolve. And that impact lasted far longer than the engine itself. In the end, the Tunnelport 302 never lived up to its promise. But the shockwaves it sent through Ford reshaped everything that followed. Its failures forced new ideas, new engineering priorities, and ultimately paved the way for the Boss engines that defined a generation. It stands as proof that even flawed projects can change the direction of an entire company. What part of this saga did you like the most? The ambition behind the design, or the fallout that came after? And if Ford had perfected the Tunnelport, would the Trans Am battles of 1969 and 1970 have played out differently? Drop your take in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from automotive history. Thanks for watching.